The Sovereign and the Scholar. A Eloquence original. Where the streets meet the literature. True power isn't about the person who can make you do something. It's about the person who makes you want to give up the right to choose. It's the eloquence of a whisper that carries more weight than a shout. Part 1. The Commission. She walked into his world carrying all of her armor. He never asked her to take it off. He simply made it heavy. Chapter 1. The Ruling. Zora, courtroom 7A Thursday. The courtroom had a particular smell. Most people never registered it, that precise layering of lemon-oiled mahogany, recycled air, and the specific, faintly stale sweat of men who believed themselves important. Zora Leigh Davis had registered it the first morning she ever walked into a courtroom, 24 years old and second chair to a partner who did not know she had written his entire case. She had registered it every day since. It was as familiar to her as her own name. Today, as on most days, she won. Judge John Branch Harrison, who had been presiding in this county for 31 years, who had a well-documented fondness for the prosecution, and who had never in Zora's professional memory made the mistake of underestimating her twice, watched from the bench as she dismantled the state's star witness with the quiet, methodical efficiency of someone rearranging furniture in a room they already owned. She did not raise her voice. She did not pivot for dramatic effect. She asked questions in the particular unhurried cadence that made opposing counsel lean slightly forward, as though they were afraid of missing something, and then she waited. The silences she built were structural, weight-bearing, load-distributing, designed to collapse the thing inside them. The witness collapsed. No further questions, Your Honor. The courtroom exhaled. Zora gathered her notes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had already moved on to the next thing. She had. Paula, the courthouse hallway moments after. Paula Branch Hicks had been watching Zora Davis win for 22 years. She had watched her win from the gallery, from the co-counsel table, from across a restaurant booth with a glass of wine in her hand, from the phone at midnight when Zora called to debrief a verdict the way other people debriefed surgical procedures, clean, sequential, methodical, with no residue left showing. Paula had watched all of it. She fell into step beside her now in the courthouse corridor, heels sinking by long habit, and waited for Zora to finish thinking whatever she was finishing. Paula, you know what your problem is. Zora did not look at her. Zora, my coffee is cold, and opposing counsel attempted a Perry Mason redirect after I had already buried him. Choose one. Paula, your problem is that you win like you're bored. You know how terrifying that is to watch. Zora, I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment. Paula, it wasn't. Julian Ford called the office again. There it was. The single beat where Zora's stride did not change, her expression did not shift, and absolutely nothing in her face acknowledged the name. Paula had been watching specifically for that, and she caught it anyway, the barest compression in the set of Zora's jaw, a thing that was over before it fully began. Zora, about the commission. Paula, he says the piece is at a critical stage and he needs your eye on it. His exact words, her eye. Zora, it is a business transaction. I commissioned a piece. He is producing it. Periodic review is standard. Paula, you have rescheduled 4 times. 4. That man has the patience of someone who is completely unbothered by the possibility that you might never show up, and I find that either deeply secure or deeply calculated, and either way you should be paying attention. Zora, I'll go Friday. Paula, you said that last Friday. Zora, this time I mean it. Paula did not say what she was thinking, which was, you meant it last Friday too, and the Friday before that, and the thing you are not saying is that meaning it and doing it are apparently 2 different problems where this particular man is concerned. She did not say any of that. She had 32 years of friendship to draw on, and she knew when Zora needed to be told something and when she needed to be left to walk toward it on her own. She let her walk. She watched the way Zora pushed open the glass door at the end of the corridor without slowing down, the afternoon light catching the line of her jaw, and Paula thought, she is already thinking about it. She has been thinking about it for 4 weeks. She thought, good. Jackie Thomas Leigh Davis and Hicks Law, that same evening. Jackie Thomas Leigh had been the receptionist at Davis and Hicks Law for 8 months. In that time she had developed a detailed internal taxonomy of the firm's moods, its rhythms, and its people. She had also developed, entirely without intending to, a running private chronicle of a thing that was happening with Zora Davis, which Jackie had titled in her head simply The Situation, and which had been unfolding since approximately 5 weeks ago when a contract had come through the office for a private commission, artists named Julian Ross Ford, and Zora had reviewed it at her desk for 11 minutes before signing it, which was 9 minutes longer than she reviewed anything. Jackie kept this information to herself. She had excellent professional judgment. She was also 23 and had read enough to know what it looked like when a woman who had spent a long time being perfectly composed encountered something that complicated the composition. At 6:15 that Thursday evening, after the building had mostly emptied, Zora came by the reception desk in her coat, briefcase in hand, and paused. Zora, clear my 9 o'clock Friday. Move it to Monday. Jackie, yes, ma'am. Should I let Mr. Brown's office know the Harmon pretrial has moved? Zora, tell them I had a scheduling conflict. Don't specify. Jackie wrote it down. She waited until Zora was at the elevator before she added a small note to the margin of the scheduling sheet. It said, Friday. The studio. And underneath that, in smaller letters, finally. She was a very observant young woman. Chapter 2. The Man in the Smoke. Dean Harrison Williams, The Studio, Thursday. Dean Harrison Williams had worked for Julian Ross Ford for 9 years. In those 9 years, he had managed studios in 3 cities, negotiated commissions with 8 international galleries, turned away 47 buyers whose intentions he had not trusted, and learned, at considerable cost to his blood pressure and his faith in linear communication, that disagreeing with Julian was essentially meteorological. You could observe it, track it, prepare for its consequences. You could not alter it. He was at his desk in the studio's anteroom when Julian came in from the courtyard, carrying a panel of copper sheet and reading it the way other men read texts, scanning, pausing, rereading a section. He wore dark canvas pants and a charcoal thermal pushed up at both elbows. He smelled of the studio, hot metal, mineral oil, something beneath that which was simply him. Dean, she rescheduled. Julian kept moving toward the primary work table. He set the copper down and reached for the annealing torch without breaking stride. Julian, I know. Dean, 4 times now. I'm beginning to think she might not come at all. Julian, she'll come Friday. Dean, she said. Julian, I know what she said. She'll come Friday. She's run out of excuses that still feel polite. When that happens, she'll come. Dean looked at him. Julian had his back to him now, the torch lit, the copper beginning to move through its color spectrum, pale straw, then a deepening amber toward the point of softness. Dean, you seem very certain for a man whose client has cancelled on him 4 consecutive times. Julian made a small adjustment to the torch angle. Julian, I'm not certain about her. I'm certain about the situation. There's a difference. Dean wrote down Friday in ink. He had learned to write Julian's certainties in ink. Julian, the studio, that night late. After Dean left, Julian worked alone. This was his preferred condition. The studio at night had a quality he could not name and had stopped trying to. The way the work lights sectioned the space, made islands of warm gold in the general dark, the particular sound of the city becoming abstract beyond the steel door, reducible to a low frequency that he could stop hearing if he chose. He was working the central section of the commission piece, a horizontal form, approximately 4 feet across, copper and reclaimed iron in a composition that had taken him 3 weeks to understand and another 2 to begin executing. He had known from the first consultation what the piece wanted to be. He had not yet decided whether to build exactly that, or something adjacent, something that held the same truth without stating it so directly. He thought about her as he worked, which was not unusual. He thought about his subjects while he worked on their commissions. He thought about what they revealed in the intake consultation, what they had been careful about, what had slipped through the care. He filed these observations the way other people filed research. What he had filed about Zora Davis. She had arrived at the initial consultation exactly on time. Not 2 minutes early, which would have signaled anxiety. Not 1 minute late, which would have signaled power testing. Exactly on time, which signaled someone who had decided precisely what impression she intended to make and had engineered the conditions accordingly. She had looked at every piece in the studio before she said a single word to him. Not a cursory scan, a real look, the kind that cost something, the kind that meant she had a vocabulary for what she was seeing. When he had asked her what she wanted the commission to do, not what she wanted it to look like, what she wanted it to do, she had paused for 4 seconds before she answered. He had counted. In those 4 seconds, he had watched her select and discard 3 answers before she gave him the one she'd been hiding behind the others. Something true, she had said. I want something that can't be negotiated with. He had made a note of it. He had been thinking about it for 6 weeks. He set down his tool. He looked at the piece. He looked at the seam where the copper met the iron, the junction he had worked most carefully, where 2 materials that did not naturally coexist had been persuaded into something that looked not just coexistent, but inevitable. He picked up his tool and made one more adjustment. Then he covered the piece with the drop cloth and went home. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Studio. Zora, the Arts District, Friday, 10:11 a.m. She drove herself, which was already a departure. She had a car service she used for professional travel and had been using it long enough that it required no thought. She drove herself on Friday morning because she had decided that she did not want someone to know the address, and then she had spent the drive recognizing that this decision was itself information. The Arts District had completed its gentrification quietly and without apology, the way these things always happened: old buildings with new intention, galleries with names, a coffee shop with floor-to-ceiling plants, and a chalkboard menu. Julian's building stood at the end of a short block, industrial face, no signage. Just a heavy steel door that did not care about foot traffic. Zora sat in the car for 90 seconds. She did this rarely. She had developed, over a career built on confident forward motion, a constitutional intolerance for the pause that signaled uncertainty. She sat in the car for 90 seconds, and then she got out. The door was unlocked. The studio, 10:17 a.m. The smell reached her before anything else did. Heated copper and mineral sawdust, and something underneath both of those, something that had soaked into the walls of the space over years of work, that was inseparable from the building now. That was both industrial and intimate in a way she could not immediately categorize. She stepped inside and let the door close behind her. The space opened upward, cathedral height, exposed steel beams, horizontal skylights that cut the morning light into long, deliberate planes. Sculptures occupied the floor in various states of completion, some draped in canvas dropcloths, some standing exposed, metal and stone, and what looked like reclaimed timber the color of old leather. The scale of everything was considered. Nothing here had been placed without thought. Julian was at the far end of the studio, working. He did not stop. He had his back to her, bent over the large horizontal piece on the primary work table, making adjustments with a hand tool she didn't recognize, and the motion of it was unhurried in the specific way of someone for whom unhurried is not an effect but a condition. Dark canvas, charcoal thermal pushed to his elbows, shoulders moving in a rhythm that had nothing to do with her arrival. She had prepared a speech in the car. She had prepared it carefully, brief acknowledgement of the scheduling delays, a professional reframe of the visit as an oversight matter, clean limits on duration. She had given some version of the speech before, to clients, to opposing counsel, to men who had misread warmth for invitation. It was a good speech. It had never failed her. Julian said, without turning. "You're pacing, Zora." She stopped. She had not realized she was. "The courtroom is closed. In here, your heels are too loud. Take them off." The first thing that moved through her was the laugh, not the real one, the professional one, the almost laugh she deployed when a witness said something so audacious that she needed a half-second to recalibrate. That sound lived at the back of her throat, and she knew exactly what to do with it. She did not make the sound. He had not asked. He had not suggested. He had not softened it with a please or dressed it in the language of a request. He had stated it the way you stated evidence already in the record. And his voice. She had spent 6 weeks deliberately not thinking about his voice, and what 6 weeks of careful avoidance had failed to dilute was now present in its full original frequency, a baritone that was not performed, not manufactured for effect. Constitutional and structural, something she felt not in her ears, but behind her sternum, in the soft architecture below conscious thought. Every mechanism she owned said, say something precise. Re-establish the coordinates. You know how to do this. Her fingers moved toward the straps of her stilettos before she had consciously authorized them. She noticed this. She noticed herself noticing, which was worse, because it meant she was watching herself comply from a remove, which meant she was choosing it from that remove. And the part of her that was choosing it was not small, and was not frightened, and did not particularly want to be talked out of it. First strap. Second strap. The sound of her heels hitting the concrete was 2 notes, hollow, resonant, definitive. She straightened. She was 6 inches shorter and suddenly fully aware of her feet on cold concrete, the dust of the studio floor against her arches, her toes curling against the chill. Her posture redistributed without permission. She was looking at his back differently than she had been a moment before. He still had not turned around. She walked forward. Each step a small, private negotiation with the floor. She stopped several feet from the work table and looked at the piece. Now that she was close, it resolved. A horizontal composition, copper and iron worked together in layers. The seam between them articulated into something that read almost like a scar, visible, healed, structural, permanent. The negative space had been considered as carefully as the positive. Everything here had been chosen. Zora, is this it? The commission. Julian, part of it. Zora, which part? Julian, the part that needed you to be in the room before I could finish it. He set down his tool then. He turned. She had spent 6 weeks preparing to meet his eyes, and she had prepared insufficiently. Memory had reduced him to components she could manage. The voice, the stillness, the inconvenient competence. It had not preserved the specific quality of his attention when he brought it fully to bear on something. It felt like weather that had decided on you. Julian, you've been rescheduling. Zora, I have a significant caseload. Julian, you've had a significant caseload your entire career. That's not what's been happening. The studio held the silence. Somewhere above them, through the skylights, clouds moved across the morning. The light shifted and resettled. Zora, you're very certain of yourself for a man whose last gallery review called his work, aggressively withholding. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The understanding that it could be one. Julian, the reviewer wanted the piece to explain itself. I don't build things that explain themselves. Come here, look at this section. She moved before she decided to. That was a pattern she was aware of and filed without resolving. She moved and stood beside him and looked where he indicated, the central seam, the junction of copper and iron, the place where the scar reading was strongest. He reached across her sightline to indicate the negative space in the upper right quadrant, his arm close to her shoulder without making contact, and the warmth of him was a physical fact she had no framework to neutralize. Julian, what do you see? Zora, a contradiction that's been made to coexist. Julian, what's the other reading? She looked at the piece for a full beat. She looked at the seam. Zora, they were always going to share the same space. You made visible what was already true. He was quiet. Then he picked up his tool and made one adjustment, a hair's width correction to the seam, a thing she almost didn't see, and set it back down. He was looking at the piece, but she had the distinct and disorienting sense that the adjustment had been a response to what she said. Julian, stay. Watch me work. It was not a question, and they both understood that. Zora Leigh Davis, who had not remained anywhere she had not planned to remain in longer than she could specifically recall, pulled the metal stool from the edge of the work table and sat down. She stayed. Chapter 4. The grammar of his hands. Zora, the studio, 2 hours later. She had not planned to stay 2 hours. She had not planned to say more than 15 sentences. She had not planned to take off her blazer at some point and set it on the work table edge behind her and then forget about it entirely, or to find herself with her elbows on her knees. Watching Julian work with the focused involuntary attention she usually reserved for closing arguments or for things that she had already recognized were going to cost her something. He talked while he worked. Not the way people talk to fill space or to hold her there or to perform intelligence for the room. He talked about the metal, and the talking was incidental, the way the sound of a fire is incidental to the heat. He talked about what copper did when it took heat, how it moved through color, straw, then amber, then orange, then a deep red violet before it reached the annealing point where it became temporarily workable. He talked about the iron with a specificity that approached the biological, how it responded differently depending on its prior history, what stresses it had already absorbed before he encountered it. Julian, most people want new stock. Clean material. No memory. I prefer reclaimed. It already has a position. Zora, that sounds like a significant complication. Julian, everything worthwhile is. He looked at her when he said that. Directly, briefly, the way he looked at the metal, not to possess it, but to read what it was actually doing. She held the look. She was good at holding things. Zora, what do you call the piece? Julian, it doesn't have a name yet. Zora, when does it get one? Julian, when I understand what it became. I don't name a thing before I know what it is. What do you call a case before the verdict? Zora, a matter. A proceeding. Something pending. Julian, same principle. She wanted to argue the distinction and found she could not entirely. The analogy was more precise than she wanted it to be. He crossed to the utility sink and ran water over his hands, working a bar of dark soap into a lather without looking at her, and the absence of his attention was almost as present as its presence. Julian, you came prepared for a shorter conversation. Zora, I had a speech. Julian, how did it open? Zora, with an apology I didn't mean and a professional reframe I had rehearsed in the car. He dried his hands. He turned. His expression said, that is the most honest thing you've said since you arrived. It also said, I knew that was true before you confirmed it. Julian, you can keep the apology. I don't need it. You want coffee? She did want coffee. She said yes. She had the abstract, unexamined sense that she had agreed to something larger, and she set this observation aside the way she set aside everything she wasn't ready to process, carefully, in a place she could find it later. David Hickory, Houston, Texas, that same evening. David Hickory had been a welder for 52 years. He had trained apprentices, rebuilt engines, restored iron fences, and fabricated structural supports for buildings that would outlast everyone currently living. He had also, for the past 30 years, been the single person in Julian Ross Ford's life whose opinion Julian sought before he acted on anything that mattered. He picked up on the second ring. Always the second. First ring was undignified. Third was discourteous. David, boy. Julian, David. David, you sound like a man who came to a conclusion and then wasn't sure he wanted to have arrived at it. Julian, the client came to the studio today. David, the attorney. Julian, yes. David, and... Julian was in his kitchen, late now, the studio locked behind him, still carrying the particular quietude of a good long day of work. He was standing at the window with a glass of water, not drinking it. Julian, she's exactly what I thought she would be and also nothing like it at the same time. David, that's always the trouble with people who've built themselves into a particular shape. You see the shape and think you know the inside. Julian, she sees the work, David. Not the surface of it, the actual work. She looked at the commission piece for 4 minutes without saying anything, and then she described the seam in terms I hadn't articulated to myself yet. David, that's rare. Julian, I know. David, what are you going to do about it? Julian, finish the piece. David, that's not a complete answer. Julian, it's the only true one I have right now. David was quiet for a moment. Julian had known him long enough to know that when David went quiet, he was selecting something specific from everything he could say. David, you know what I learned in 40-some years of working metal. You can't rush the anneal. You get it to the right heat, and then you have to let it cool in its own time. You try to hurry it, and the material gets brittle. It breaks at the seam right at the place where you worked hardest to join it. Julian, I know that. David, I know you know it. I'm saying it because it applies to more things than metal. Julian looked at the window. At the city behind it. Julian, good night, David. David, good night, boy. Chapter 5. What the metal holds. Zora, her apartment, Friday night. She did not think about the studio. She made tea. She reviewed the motion brief she had pushed to Monday. She answered 3 emails that could have waited until morning and 1 that genuinely couldn't. She stood at her kitchen window with the mug going lukewarm in both hands and watched the city in the way she had always watched it, as a comprehensible system, a machine with knowable logic, a thing she could parse and position herself within. She did not think about the studio. She thought about the way he had said come here in exactly the same register as the copper does this at heat, not a command dressed for effect, not a request hedged with apology, simply a statement of what was supposed to happen next. Delivered with the quiet expectation of a man who had considered the outcome already and found it settled. She thought about 2 hours passing without her checking her phone. She thought about the weight of her heels in her hand as she walked back to the car at noon, carrying them instead of wearing them. And how she had not put them back on until she reached the parking garage, and how that small detail was telling her something she was not fully ready to hear. She set down the mug. She went to her home office. She sat at her desk and opened the commission contract on her laptop, the formal document, all parties and amounts and terms, and she read his name in the header, and the room was very quiet, and she thought, there are 37 words in this contract, and not one of them is sufficient for what this is. She closed the laptop. She called her sister, Rachel, Charlotte, North Carolina, the same night. Rachel Leigh Davis Brown answered on the third ring, which meant she was already in bed and had looked at the name on the screen and made a deliberate decision to answer anyway, which she always did when Zora called after 10. Rachel, it's 11 o'clock. Zora, I know. Rachel, you never call at 11 unless something is making you uncomfortable. Zora, I call at 11 when I have time. Rachel, Zora. Silence. Outside, the city. Inside, the particular quality of a long-distance silence between sisters who have known each other their whole lives and have no effective defenses against each other. Zora, I went to the studio today. Rachel, the sculptor. Zora, he's a metal artist. Primarily copper and reclaimed iron. Rachel, you just corrected my vocabulary, which means this is already complicated. How long were you there? Zora, 2.5 hours. A pause. The sound of Rachel sitting up. Rachel, Zora. You have never spent 2.5 hours anywhere that was not a courtroom or a deposition without looking at your phone. You cannot sit through a 90-minute film without. Zora, I know. Rachel, what is he like? Zora looked at the ceiling. She thought about how to answer that with precision. She thought about the tool adjustments and the anneal lecture and the coffee made on a work table that also held a structural engineering manual and a photograph of an old man in Houston. She thought about the single moment when he had turned and looked at her with the full weight of his attention and how she had had to physically remind herself to breathe at a regular interval. Zora, he's very quiet. Rachel, Zora, he doesn't need the room to confirm that he's in it. Rachel, oh. Zora, Rachel. Rachel, I didn't say anything. Zora, you said oh in a very specific tone. Rachel, I said oh because you just described a man who is going to be an absolute problem for you, and I was taking a moment to appreciate the situation. Are you going back? Zora was quiet for 3 seconds. Zora, the commission isn't finished. Rachel, that's not what I asked. Zora, good night, Rachel. Rachel, good night, Zora. Drink some water. You sound like a woman who is about to be very inconveniently human, and that requires hydration. Zora hung up. She did not drink water. She sat in the quiet of her home office for a while and listened to the city and thought, with a precision she would not have admitted to anyone, yes, I am going back. Chapter 6. Opposing counsel. Stephen Martin Brown, his office, Monday morning. Stephen Martin Brown was a good lawyer. He had accepted this about himself with the same equanimity with which he had accepted his height, his tendency to overthink, and his taste for jazz records that were too obscure to discuss at firm events. He was a good lawyer. He was not. He had come to understand over 3 encounters in 3 courtrooms, a match for Zora Davis. This bothered him professionally. Separately and entirely of its own accord, the fact of her bothered him in ways that had nothing to do with the law, and he had been managing this second bothering with varying degrees of success since the first time she had introduced herself at a bar association dinner 4 years ago, extended her hand, met his eyes with the direct, measuring clarity of someone who was already deciding what category to put him in, and then, before he could fully recover from the handshake, turned to greet the federal judge on her other side. He had filed her under formidable, untouchable by choice. Interesting. He had not changed the filing. He was reviewing the Harmon pretrial brief on Monday morning when his assistant put a message on his desk, Davis and Hicks requesting continuance, scheduling conflict. He looked at the message. He thought about calling to confirm the new date and then decided not to, because calling would require a reason, and the most honest reason was that he wanted to hear her voice on the phone, and that was not a reason he was prepared to use. He went back to the brief. It was very good. He rewrote the third argument anyway, because the image of her reading it was already in his head, and he wanted it to be better than very good. He was aware this was not purely professional. He had accepted that too. Julian and Jaquan, the studio, Tuesday. Jaquan Martin Ford arrived at his brother's studio the way he arrived everywhere, loud, certain, and carrying food he had decided was necessary without consulting anyone. He was 6 feet of assembled chaos with Julian's bone structure and approximately none of his stillness. And he walked into the studio at 11 on a Tuesday morning with a bag from a Jamaican spot 2 blocks over and the particular energy of a man who had already had 3 conversations before most people had finished their first coffee. Jaquan, why is it always 50 degrees in here? You're literally working with fire. Julian, the ventilation. Jaquan, the ventilation is doing the most. Dean said you've been in here till midnight every night this week. Julian, the piece is at a complicated stage. Jaquan, the piece or the person the piece is for? Julian set down his tool and turned around. He looked at his brother with the specific expression he had used on Jaquan since they were children, the one that said, I see exactly what you're doing and I'm going to let you finish. Jaquan, don't do the face. I've been immune to the face since I was 9. Dean told me she came in Friday. Julian, Dean talks too much. Jaquan, Dean's worried about you. I'm not. I'm interested. There's a difference. Is she good people? Julian was quiet for a moment. He took the food bag from Jaquan because it was going to end up on his work table anyway. Julian, she's constructed. Very deliberately constructed. The way a building is constructed, everything serves a function. Everything distributes load. You'd look at it and say, impressive. But if you look at the places where the structure is working hardest, that's where the real information is. Jaquan, and what's the real information? Julian, that there's something inside the structure that it wasn't designed to contain. Jaquan opened his food and ate half of it in thoughtful silence, which was unusual for him, and which meant he was taking this seriously. Jaquan, you like her. Julian, I find her interesting. Jaquan, Julian. I have watched you find about 6 things interesting in 38 years. A vein of copper ore in Arizona. That coal train recording from 65. The structural logic of suspension bridges. The dog that used to live on our street when we were kids. And now apparently this woman. Interesting from you is what other people mean when they can't sleep. Julian looked at him. He did not deny it. He handed back the half of the food Jaquan had given him and went back to work, which was his version of, yes, you're right, and we're going to stop talking about it now. Jaquan let it go. He had spent 38 years knowing when to push and when to sit with his brother in the particular quiet that Julian wore like a second skin, and he knew which this was. He stayed another 2 hours. He didn't ask any more questions. He ate his food and watched his brother work and thought, she better be worth it. She better be real. He thought, I think she might be. Part 2. The Blind Ambition. You cannot navigate your way through a thing you will not admit you're inside of. Chapter 7. The Return. Zora, the studio, the following Friday, 9 a.m. She had not called ahead. She had decided during the week that calling ahead gave the act too much ceremony, made it a thing she was negotiating with herself about, and what she wanted, or what she told herself she wanted, was for this to feel like a routine professional visit. Unremarkable, easily categorized. She was aware of the gap between what she told herself and what was true. She was choosing, deliberately and with full knowledge, not to close it yet. The steel door. The smell. The high industrial space and the morning light coming through the skylights in its long, deliberate planes. Nothing had changed. She had been gone a week and nothing in the studio knew it. Julian was at the work table. He did not stop working. He did not turn. You came back. Stated. Not asked. The commission required additional review. Is that what it required? Not a question. The way most of what he said was not quite a question. She walked forward. She reached the work table edge. She looked at the piece, which had moved forward in her absence. The seam she had described last week had been developed further, the junction rendered with an intricacy that had not been there before. Zora, you worked on the seam. Julian, you gave me the right language for it. The language changed the work. She looked at him. He was still focused on the piece, making a small adjustment. Zora, that happens? Someone's words change the direction of the work. Julian, when the words are accurate. Most people describe what they want to see. You described what was there. That's different. She sat on the stool without being invited. She had decided somewhere in the past week that she was done waiting to be invited to the things she had already decided to do. She did not take off her heels. She had not been asked. Julian looked at her feet. He looked back at the work. He said nothing about it, but something in the corner of his expression acknowledged the choice she had made and filed it the same way she filed things carefully, in a place to find later. They worked. He worked. She watched. And somewhere in the second hour, without ceremony or announcement, she reached into her bag and pulled out a legal brief she had brought to give herself permission to be here for a purpose, and she opened it on her lap, and she did not read a single word of it. And they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Paula, Davis, and Hicks, that afternoon. Paula intercepted Zora in the corridor outside the conference room at 3 o'clock and fell into step with her in the way that meant, I am going to say a thing, and I have decided the corridor is the appropriate venue. Paula, Jackie says you were out all morning. Zora, I had a site visit. Paula, the studio. Zora, the commission site, yes. Paula, and then, Stephen Brown's office called about rescheduling the Harmon pretrial. Zora, what date did they propose? Paula, they were flexible. Unusually flexible. His assistant said, quote, Mr. Brown is happy to work around Ms. Davis's schedule, which is the most accommodating that man has ever been about anything, and I want you to know that I noticed. Zora, noted. Schedule it for the 15th. Paula, I will. Zora. Zora, Paula. Paula, you're going to keep going back, aren't you? Zora stopped walking. She considered the question with the precision she brought to questions that deserved it. Zora, the commission isn't finished. Paula, that wasn't the question. A beat. The corridor was empty. Paula waited. Zora, yes. I'm going to keep going back. Paula nodded once. She had known. She had been waiting for Zora to know it too. Paula, okay. I want regular updates. Zora, absolutely not. Paula, Zora. I have watched you be impenetrable for 22 years. I have earned this. Zora almost smiled. Almost. Zora, good afternoon, Paula. She walked away. Paula watched her go and thought, she's already different. She's been different for 2 weeks and she thinks she's hiding it, and she is not hiding it at all. She thought. Thank God. It was past time. Chapter 8. The private dinner. Zora, Julian's loft, a Wednesday evening. He had invited her to dinner the way he did everything, without elaboration, without persuasion, as a simple statement of what was going to happen. She had said yes the way she was learning to say yes to him, which was without the qualifying clauses and conversational load-bearing walls she normally required. His loft was 3 floors above the studio, accessed through a separate entrance, and it was nothing like what she had expected and exactly what she should have predicted. Spare, considered, everything present for a reason. Bookshelves built into the east wall floor to ceiling, engineering texts, metallurgy, art history. A section of fiction she noticed held Baldwin and Morrison and Achebe, and a worn copy of Invisible Man with a Broken Spine. A table near the north window set for 2, the city visible through the glass, the night just beginning to make itself known in the middle distance. She noticed that the table had no food on it yet. She noticed, on the chair nearest the window, a silk tie laid out across the seat, charcoal gray, expensive, deliberate. Julian came out of the kitchen. He had changed from the studio clothes, dark trousers, a shirt the color of deep water, no tie. He looked at her looking at the chair. Julian, I want to try something, if you'll let me. Zora, what kind of something? Julian, the kind that requires trust. Which means it also requires that you choose it clearly, not just go along with it. She looked at him. This was the quality that had been disassembling her careful architecture since the first day she walked into the studio. He did not proceed without consent, and his asking for it was not performance, not negotiation strategy. Not the careful choreography of a man who wanted something and was managing her toward it. He was genuinely asking. The asking had weight because he would actually stop if she said no, and they both understood that. Zora, tell me what it is first. Julian, I want to know if you can find your way through the dark without your logic to guide you. The tie, cover your eyes. Don't ask why. Just do it or don't. The scholar in her, the woman who had been building arguments since she was 12 years old, who had spent 20 years in rooms where her ability to think faster than anyone around her was the only currency that mattered, rose to the surface of her chest with something that was almost indignation. And then fell quiet. She picked up the silk tie. The fabric was cool and heavier than it looked, the kind of quality that had weight and intention. She held it between both hands, and there was a moment, a real moment, not a theatrical one, where she was entirely aware that she was standing in a man's apartment about to blindfold herself of her own free will, and that of her own free will was the specific part that made it possible. He had not coaxed her. He had not constructed an argument. He had offered and stepped back and let her choose in full visibility. She folded the silk. She raised it. When the fabric pulled taut across her eyes and the world went to darkness and warm pressure, something in her nervous system she had not known was gripping released. All of it displaced forward into the other senses, the sound of the city through the glass, closer now, the creak of the floor under his feet, 15 feet away, then 12, the temperature difference between where he stood and where she stood, a warmth in the air that preceded contact, the smell of him, which was cedar and metal and clean skin, and something underneath that she had been cataloging for weeks without a word for it. Her other senses expanded into the space her vision had been occupying. She heard the fabric of his shirt move as he stepped closer. She felt the warm column of air that was his presence before she could have located him precisely. She was, she realized, navigating by something other than logic, and the discovery did not frighten her the way she would have predicted. It felt, impossibly, like relief. Julian moved to her right side, not quite touching, and spoke close to her ear, low enough that it was only for her. Tell me what you hear. The city. Your breathing. The floorboards. The heat from you. That's closest. What else? She turned her head slightly toward him. She had no visual reference. She had only the sound of his voice as a coordinate. Zora, I hear the difference between where you are and where you aren't. I hear the room around you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with great deliberateness, he placed one finger under her chin and tilted her head back. Her knees registered the motion before the rest of her did. She did not fall. She understood, in the blind dark with his single point of contact at the hinge of her jaw, that she was not falling. She was descending into a space that had different rules than the one she normally inhabited, and he was the only landmark available, and she was choosing, actively, consciously, with every faculty she possessed, to let him be that. Julian, that's enough for now. He removed his finger. He stepped back. He moved to the kitchen. And Zora, still blindfolded, standing in the dark of his loft with the city below the windows and her heart doing something she was going to need time alone to properly examine, heard him uncorking a wine bottle and thought, I am completely undone, and I chose every step of it, and I would choose it again. She took off the silk. She smoothed her expression. She sat at the table. He brought the wine. He did not mention what had just happened, because there was nothing to add to it. They had dinner. They talked for 3 hours. She drove home at 11:30 with both hands on the wheel and the silk tie on the passenger seat, where she had put it after folding it, because he had told her to keep it, and she had not argued with him, and was not going to. Chapter 9. The Harmon Matter. Courtroom 4, the Harmon Peer retrial, a Thursday. Zora had prepared the Harmon pre-trial the way she prepared everything, completely, well in advance, without visible anxiety. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:15, reviewed her notes in the car, walked through security at 8:45, and was at counsel's table by 8:50 with her materials organized and her face arranged in the particular expression of composed readiness that she had calibrated over 20 years. Stephen Brown was already there. He stood at the defense table arranging his own materials, and when she came in he looked up, and the look lasted about 1 beat longer than strictly necessary, and she noted this without expression and settled into her chair. Stephen, Counselor Davis. Zora, Counselor Brown. You look well. Stephen, you look formidable. As always. Zora, that's the idea. The hearing proceeded. Zora was excellent, as she was always excellent, and Stephen was better than she usually gave him credit for being, which she noted clinically in the back of her mind while dismantling his third argument with a precision that was, she could admit privately, a little beyond what the moment strictly required. Afterward, in the corridor outside courtroom 4, he fell into step beside her in a way that was different from Paula falling into step beside her, more tentative, more considered, with a question inside it that he had not yet committed to asking. Stephen, you have time for coffee? She looked at him. She had known Stephen Brown for 4 years. He was a good lawyer, better than his record against her suggested, and he was a careful and decent man, and she had been aware for some time of the nature of his interest in her and had been maintaining a comfortable professional distance from it. Zora, I have at 2 o'clock. Stephen, it's 11:30. A pause. She thought about Julian in a studio 12 blocks away, working without looking at the clock because time in the studio did not operate the way it operated elsewhere. She thought about a silk tie folded on her nightstand. Zora, coffee would be fine. Give me 20 minutes. They found a place 2 blocks from the courthouse. Stephen ordered black coffee. She ordered a cortado. They sat across from each other in the window, the street moving past in its ordinary Friday rhythm, and she looked at him with the clear direct attention she brought to things she was deciding about. Stephen, I want to say something that may change how you categorize me professionally, and I've decided to say it anyway. Zora, you have my attention. Stephen, I have wanted to ask you to dinner for 2 years. I have been not asking for 2 years because I was not sure the moment was right. I am telling you now because 2014, because I think the window might be closing, and I would rather know. Zora looked at him. She appreciated the honesty of it, the courage it required to say a thing plainly without a hedge. She thought about what that kind of plainness had cost him. She thought about what honesty deserved in return. Zora, Stephen. I'm going to tell you something because you were straight with me and you deserve the same. There is someone. It's early and I don't have language for it yet, but it's real. And you're a good man, and you should be asking that question, just not to me. Not right now. He was quiet. He looked at his coffee. He was processing this with the same composure he brought to adverse rulings, absorbing the impact, stabilizing, determining what came next. Stephen, fair enough. Is he good to you? The question surprised her. She looked at him. Zora, he's very deliberate. He doesn't do things carelessly. Stephen, that's a careful answer. Zora, it's the only accurate one I have right now. He nodded. He finished his coffee. They walked back toward the courthouse as colleagues, and that was what they remained, though something between them had shifted slightly, become more honest, less guarded, the way things become when a true thing has been said plainly in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning. Stephen held the door for her. She nodded once and went back to work. Chapter 10. Copper and Consequence. The studio, a Saturday afternoon. The commission was nearly complete. Julian had been working toward this point for 8 weeks, and now that it was close he moved differently around it, with the particular care of someone approaching the end of a process that has been meaningful, not trying to hurry it or extend it, just staying present to what it was. Zora had come that Saturday without being invited, which had become the pattern. She came on Fridays and sometimes on Saturdays, and she had stopped framing it as oversight and stopped framing it as anything. She came because this was where she came now. She was on the stool. She had brought nothing with her, no brief, no work, no prop to justify her presence. She sat with her feet flat on the floor and her hands quiet in her lap, and she watched him work. Julian straightened. He looked at the piece for a long time. Julian, come here. She stood. She crossed the studio and stood beside him and looked at what it had become. It was extraordinary. She was not someone who used that word, but it was the only one. The copper and the iron had been resolved into a horizontal composition of genuine beauty, not decorative, not merely impressive, but emotionally precise. The way only things that were made by someone who understood what they were doing with full seriousness could be. The seam she had described weeks ago as a scar was the center of it, and she understood now that it had been the center all along. Zora, it's finished. Julian, almost. Zora, what's missing? He turned to her. He had been building toward saying something for a long time, and she could feel it the way you feel weather building before it arrives. Julian, a name. The piece needs its name. Zora, what is it? Julian, I was hoping you could tell me. You've been in the room with it from the beginning. You described it before I did. What is it? She looked at the piece. She looked at the seam, the copper and the iron, the negative space that had been planned for, the two materials that did not naturally belong together and had been made into something that looked not just coexistent but inevitable, like they had always been heading toward this. She looked at it for a long time. And then she knew. Zora, what remains? Julian was quiet. He looked at the piece. Julian, say the rest. She almost said, there is no rest. But there was. Zora, what remains when you stop performing? What remains when the structure comes down and you find out what was inside it? He nodded. Once slowly. Julian, what remains? He said it the way he said everything as a settled fact. He turned and wrote it in the work journal on the work table, and then he set down the pen and looked at her. Julian, I need to tell you something. Zora, all right. Julian, this piece, I built it for you. Not to your specifications. For you. I built what I saw when I looked at you the first time you walked through that door. And I would have built it whether or not you kept coming back. The studio was very quiet. The skylight above them had gone amber with the late afternoon. She thought about the 41-minute initial consultation and the deposit check she had written without looking up and the 6 weeks she had spent carefully not thinking about him. She thought about her heels on the concrete floor. About his silk tie in the dark. About the seam described as a scar that healed into something structural. She thought, I have been seen. I have been genuinely seen by this man, and it has been happening since the beginning, and I have been the last to know, and none of that changes what is true. Zora, I know. He waited. Zora, I have known for a while. I was working up to being willing to say it out loud. Julian, and now. She held his gaze. Zora Davis, who held everything. Zora, now I'm saying it out loud. You are the single most inconvenient thing that has happened to me in 20 years, Julian Ford, and I haven't been able to stay away from your studio for 6 consecutive weeks, and I don't intend to start. The corner of his mouth moved. It was a real smile this time, not the suggestion of one. She had been waiting to see it. He crossed the distance between them without hurrying. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, his hands at her face, one at her jaw, deliberate and warm, the way he touched everything he was certain of, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention and said quietly, You are the most complicated thing I have ever tried to understand. And I intend to keep trying. She let him. Part 3. The copper contract. I told you I'd build you a cage. I never said I'd lock the door. You stay because you want to be known. Chapter 11. Whose name is written on your pulse? Julian's loft, 3 weeks later, evening. She had begun to know the shape of his apartment the way she knew the shape of her own, which cabinets held which things, how the light moved through the north windows across the day. The precise point in the evening when the city outside began to sound like itself rather than like traffic. She had begun to know these things without trying to learn them, which meant they had entered her through some other channel, and she thought about that sometimes on the drive home. Julian was in the studio when she arrived, and Dean let her up with the particular expression he now wore around her, resigned, not unkind, the look of someone who has adjusted their expectations and found the adjustment acceptable. She had grown to like Dean Williams. He was exact and tired and protective of Julian in a way that had nothing to do with the professional, and she respected that. She was at the window with a glass of wine when Julian came up from the studio. He had washed the studio off his hands, but not entirely off his person. There was still the faint mineral warmth of it, the smell that had become, she could admit, associated in her body with the specific feeling of being in a room where the temperature was exactly right. He poured himself a glass. He sat across from her at the window table. They looked at the city for a moment, the particular comfortable silence that they had built together, that was different from being alone and different from the kind of silence that needed filling. Julian, I want to show you something. He went to the workbench at the far side of the loft, a secondary one, smaller, for work that didn't require the studio's full scale, and came back with something that lay across both his palms, catching the lamplight. It was a chain. Copper, hand-wrought, each length the size of her thumbnail, with a delicacy that should not have been possible in metal and was. It was light as a whisper and precise as intention. He set it on the table between them. Zora, you made this. Julian, this week. Zora, what is it for? Julian, I want to put it on you. If you want. She looked at it. She thought about the question inside the question. She had been in enough rooms with enough people to know the difference between a man who wanted to possess something and a man who wanted to honor it. Julian had been demonstrating that difference since the first day she walked through his door, and she knew it now the way she knew the apartment, without trying. She nodded. He lifted the chain. He draped it across her collarbone, the cool weight of it landing against her skin with the precision of something that had been planned for a specific place. The copper was cold from the room, and then it was not cold. It warmed in approximately 6 seconds, taking on her temperature, and the sensation of that, of something taking on her specific warmth, was not something she could have anticipated or would have known to miss. He stepped back. Julian, I told you I'd build you a cage someday. I never said I'd lock the door. She looked up at him. Julian, you stay because you want to be known. Not because I'm keeping you. Tell me, whose name is on your pulse right now? She had an answer for everything. She had been building answers since childhood, had constructed an entire professional identity out of the ability to meet any question with a response that was both true and navigated. She could cross-examine a hostile witness for 4 hours without losing the thread. She could stand in a courtroom and make the impossible sound inevitable. She had no speech for this. Not because she didn't know the answer. Because the answer was not a speech. The answer was in the warmth of the copper at her collarbone and the specific quality of the way he was looking at her, patient, certain, with no pressure attached because he already knew, and asking was a courtesy to her own timing. A space he had created for her to say the true thing without being rushed into it. She felt the chain rise and fall with her breathing. She felt her own pulse in the places where the copper rested. She thought, I have spent 20 years being unreadable. And this man read me from across the studio on the day we met. And I have not been able to walk away from that. She thought, this is not surrender. This is the most sovereign thing I have ever done. She moved into a space. Not retreating, not being pulled, moving, choosing, with her whole self present and nothing held back. She put her hands on his forearms, not to push him away. To anchor herself. To tell him, in the language his hands had been teaching her, what she couldn't yet fully put into words. He understood. He always understood. He pulled her close the way he worked, deliberate, unhurried, certain of the outcome, and his arms around her were solid and warm, and she felt, against the wall of his chest, her own heartbeat doing something it had not done in years, which was simply to beat without armor, without management, without performing steadiness for a room. Julian, you don't have to say it. She pulled back just far enough to look at him. Zora, I want to say it. She said his name. Just his name. In the quiet of the loft with the city below the windows and the copper warm at her collarbone, she said his name the way you say something you have been carrying for a long time and have finally found the room to set down. He held it like it weighed what it weighed. Chapter 12. Dean's accounting. Dean Harrison Williams, his apartment, that same night. Dean Harrison Williams poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and sat in his reading chair and thought about the fact that Zora Davis's coat was hanging on the hook by Julian's studio entrance, which it had been for the past 3 weeks at varying hours of the day, and that Julian had started coming into the studio in the mornings with a different quality of stillness than the one he'd brought for the past decade. Dean was not a romantic. He was a logistics man. But he had spent 9 years working close enough to Julian Ford to understand the man's interior weather, and what he understood about the current weather was this. Julian had found something real. Julian had found something that matched the frequency of how he moved through the world, and it had arrived in the form of a defense attorney in a slate blazer who had taken off her heels before she was asked on her second visit, and who read his work with the same precision he brought to the metal. Dean drank his scotch. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Jaquan last week, Jaquan calling from Atlanta with the particular energy of someone who was managing his excitement very poorly. Jaquan, Dean. Is she real? Dean, yes. Jaquan, is she good? Dean, she's exacting. She has very high standards and she is applying them to this situation and she is not pretending otherwise. Yes, she is good. Jaquan, does she know what she has? Dean had thought about this one. Dean, I think she's in the process of finding out. I think it's going to surprise her more than she expected. Jaquan, good. He deserves someone that it costs something to love, right? Dean had agreed with that. He agreed with it now, looking at his scotch, thinking about the coat on the hook and the piece called What Remains and the particular quality of Julian's silence at 8 in the morning, which was no longer the silence of a man alone in his work, but the silence of a man who had a place to return to. He finished his drink. He turned off the lamp. He went asleep thinking, 9 years, and I never thought it would look like this. I'm glad it does. Chapter 13. The admission. Zora and Paula Davis and Hicks, a Monday morning. Paula found her in the kitchen at 7:45, before any of the associates arrived, before Jackie had settled at the front desk, in the quiet window of the building that belonged only to the two of them. Zora was making coffee with the focused attention of someone who was thinking about something else and using the coffee as a container for it. Paula poured herself a cup and leaned against the counter and waited. Zora, don't. Paula, I haven't said anything. Zora, you're doing the waiting thing. The specific waiting thing where you already know what you want me to say and you're just giving me room to get there. Paula, that's called being a good friend. Zora, it's extremely irritating. Paula, Zora, tell me something. Silence. The coffee maker finished. Zora poured. She turned and looked at Paula and Paula looked back with 32 years of friendship in her eyes and not a word of pressure. Zora, I'm in love with him. Paula set her mug down. Paula, I know. Zora, you've known. Paula, I knew before you knew. You've been in love with him since week 3. You've just been completing the internal brief, building the case, making sure the evidence was sufficient before you entered a verdict. Zora, that is not entirely inaccurate. Paula, is it returned? Zora thought about the copper chain. About the name of the piece. About what he had said in the studio 8 weeks ago, I built it for you. About a voice that entered a room and stayed in her body afterward like a frequency she couldn't unhear. Zora, yes. Entirely. Paula, good. And then Paula did the thing that Paula had done exactly 3 times in 32 years of friendship, which was cross the kitchen and hold her without any words, and Zora let herself be held without managing it or timing it or composing her expression. And she thought, this is what he has been making possible. Not just with him. With everyone. The permission to be held by the real. The associates started to arrive. They separated. They went back to work. But the morning was different than it had been. Chapter 14. What Remains is installed. Zora's home, a Saturday in spring. The installation took 4 hours. Julian brought 2 assistants and Dean and what looked like a small engineering solution for the entry wall, and Zora stayed out of the way in the kitchen making coffee that no one had time to drink and watching through the doorway while they figured out the physics of it. The piece went on the north wall of the entry, the first thing visible when you walked through the front door, the last thing you passed when you left. It was exactly right there, and she had not known it until she saw it. When the assistants and dean had gone, Julian and Zora stood together in the entry and looked at it. What remains? The copper and iron resolved. The scar seam that had become the center. The negative space around it that had been planned for all along. Julian, does it do what you needed it to? She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the colleague's wife at the funeral, who had said, "Every time I look at it I know something true about him that he never said out loud." Zora, yes. It tells the truth about me. I can see it from every angle. Julian, that was always the intention. She turned to him. She was standing in her own entry, barefoot, without armor, with a piece of metal on her wall that she could not look at without being fully known by it, and the man who had built it was standing 4 feet away waiting for nothing, needing nothing, simply present. Zora, I need you to know something. Julian, tell me. Zora, I have spent my entire career being the person who doesn't need anything that she hasn't built herself. I built this apartment, this practice, this life, all of it deliberate, all of it designed. And I walked into your studio and I watched you work and you didn't try to change anything about how I was built, and somehow. She stopped. She looked at the piece. Zora, somehow the whole structure changed anyway. He crossed to her. He did what he always did, moved deliberately, made contact with both hands at her face, held her with the full weight of his attention. That's not the structure changing. That's you finding out what was inside it all along. She thought, yes. That is exactly what this is. She said, yes. She stayed. Chapter 15. What the Body Remembers. Zora's apartment, that night. The city was quiet by the time everything settled, the lamps on low, the entry piece catching the ambient light and doing something with it that was almost meditative. The two of them in the living room with the last of the wine and the comfortable silence of people who had run out of need to fill it. Julian was in the chair by the window. Zora was on the couch with her legs folded under her, and she was looking at him the way she looked at the commission piece that first day, not at the surface of him, at what was actually there. Zora, can I ask you something? Julian, yes. Zora, that first day. The heels. Did you know what it would do? He looked at her steadily. Julian, I knew you were pacing. I knew the sound was a defense mechanism. I didn't know what removing it would do to you. I just knew it was true that you didn't need it in that room. So I said the true thing. Zora, you say a lot of true things. Julian, it's the most efficient approach. Untrue things require maintenance. She laughed. A real one. Not the professional almost laugh, not the managed warmth she deployed in professional settings, a real laugh, the kind that was slightly undignified and didn't care. It changed her face completely. He was already watching for it, and when it arrived he looked at her the way he had looked at the commission piece on its best day, with the satisfaction of someone who has been working toward a thing for a long time and has seen it become what it was supposed to be. Zora, I am going to be deeply inconvenient to love, Julian. I want you to know that I know this. Julian, I've been working with difficult materials my whole career. Zora, I'm serious. Julian, so am I. She looked at him. She thought about the annealing, the copper that had to be heated to exactly the right temperature and then allowed to cool in its own time, or it would get brittle at the seam. She thought about how she had been running too hot for too long, had been held at temperature for years without the cool down, and what it had cost the places where she was joined to things. She thought about the seam that had been described as a scar, and how a scar was just what a wound looked like once it had become structural. Julian, come here. She uncurled from the couch. She crossed the room. She sat on the arm of the chair, and then he arranged her into the chair properly, his arm around her head against his shoulder, and the warmth of him was the same warmth it had been in the studio for weeks, specific, reliable. The temperature of something that would be there when you looked for it. She let herself be held. She did not time it. She did not manage it. She let the weight of him be real, and the weight of the room be real, and the piece on the wall in the entry catching the ambient light be real, and she thought, this is what it costs to be fully here, and the cost is not too high. The cost is what it was always going to be. The city moved below the windows. The night did what nights do. Zora Leigh Davis, the sovereign, did not perform anything. She breathed. She stayed. She was home. Epilogue. 6 months later. Jackie Thomas Leigh Davis and Hicks, a Monday morning. Jackie Thomas Leigh updated the internal scheduling sheet at 8:15, noted that Zora Davis had a 9 o'clock with the Harmon Appeals team, a 1 o'clock deposition, and a 4 o'clock she had blocked simply with the word studio. This was not unusual. The 4 o'clock studio block appeared approximately 3 times a week. Jackie had long since closed the mental file she had titled The Situation. She had retitled it The Outcome, which was her private acknowledgement that things had resolved in the direction she had predicted, and she felt a quiet professional satisfaction about this that she was smart enough not to mention to anyone. She looked up when Zora came through the glass doors at 8:50. Zora was in a charcoal blazer and wide trousers, and her braids were down today, which was the other pin, the one Jackie had categorized as, she is going somewhere after this that she has thought about. She was wearing earrings that caught the light. On her left wrist, half visible below the cuff of the blazer, was a fine chain the color of copper. Jackie, good morning, Miss Davis. You have the Harmon team at 9. Zora, thank you, Jackie. Hold any non-urgent calls until 11. Jackie, yes, ma'am. Zora walked toward the corridor. At the corner, she paused. Zora, Jackie. Jackie, yes, ma'am. Zora turned. She looked at Jackie with the clear, direct attention that she brought to things she had decided about. Zora, you've been good at your job since the first week you were here. I should have said so earlier. You'll hear from Paula about the title change and the revised compensation, effective next month. Jackie sat very still for a moment. Then she said, with all the composure of a woman who has been witnessed seeing everything she was not supposed to see and is now being recognized for it. Jackie, thank you, Miss Davis. I appreciate that. Zora nodded once and went to win her 9 o'clock. Jackie turned back to her screen. She made one note on the scheduling sheet, in small letters in the margin, where she had been keeping her private chronicle since the beginning. The copper chain on her wrist. She's not hiding it. She's wearing it where everyone can see. Then, in even smaller letters. Good. Stephen Brown, courthouse steps, that same Monday. Stephen Martin Brown ran into Dean Harrison Williams on the courthouse steps at 11:30, each of them heading opposite directions. They had been introduced at a Davis and Hicks Gallery event 2 months ago and had discovered, to both their mild surprise, that they liked each other. Stephen, Williams. Dean, Brown. You in trial. Stephen, deposition. You, Dean, filing commission paperwork. Julian sold 3 pieces to a collector in Chicago last week. Stephen, that's good news. Dean, it is. They stood in the weak spring sun for a moment, 2 men who orbited the same fixed points from different angles. Stephen, they're good together. Ford and Zora. Dean looked at him. He took the measure of the statement, its honesty, the slight cost it had taken to say it. Dean, yes. They are. Stephen, he's good to her. Dean, he's constitutionally incapable of being anything else. You'll find your version of it, Brown. You're a decent man. Stephen, that's an unexpectedly kind thing to say. Dean, don't make it weird. I have paperwork. Dean went. Stephen went. The courthouse steps held the morning in its ordinary way, indifferent and reliable. He thought, decent men do find it. Just not always on the timeline they'd have chosen. He thought, all right. He went to his deposition. Julian and Zora, the studio, that evening. She arrived at 4:15. He was in the middle of the early stages of a new commission, something vertical this time, taller than a man, copper sheeting over a welded iron armature. It was going to take 6 months and he was already in love with it. She came through the steel door. She didn't knock. She set her bag on the secondary table and took off her heels at the entrance, both of them, setting them neatly against the wall, and padded barefoot across the cool concrete toward him. He did not stop working. He said, without turning. How is the Harmon team? Unprepared. They'll be ready by Thursday or I'll replace the second chair. Will you actually replace him? No. But he doesn't know that. What are you building? Something vertical. Still finding out what it is. She pulled the stool to its position at the edge of the work table. The same stool, the same position, a spot that had become hers through repetition and claim, and sat down. She put her elbows on her knees. She watched him work. After a while she said, Zora, Paula wants to do a dinner. You, her husband Ross. She's been asking since January. Julian, tell her yes. Zora, you don't need to check your calendar? Julian, Dean keeps my calendar. He'll work it out. Tell her yes. Zora pulled out her phone and sent the text. She put the phone away. She watched him work. The studio smelled of heated copper and mineral oil and the specific, accumulated warmth of the work. The skylights above them held the last of the evening light in their long, deliberate planes. Somewhere outside, the city moved in its ordinary rhythm, and in here that was simply background. She thought about the piece on her entry wall, catching the ambient light every morning when she left and every night when she came home. She thought about 37 words in a contract that had turned out to be entirely insufficient, and how she had been the last to know, and how being the last to know had not changed anything that mattered. She thought, I am here. I am completely here. And the here is enormous. Julian set down his tool. He turned around. He looked at her across the studio, this woman on this stool in the warm work light with her shoes at the door and her copper chain at her wrist, and nothing in her face performing anything, and he thought, there is not one thing I would change about what this became. He crossed to where she was. He stood close. She looked up at him. Stay. She was already staying. She stayed. A strong woman doesn't need a man to lead her. She needs a man who is strong enough to hold still while she decides to follow. And when she follows, and she does it freely, with her eyes open and her whole self present, that is not weakness. That is the most powerful thing a sovereign person can do. Hood Eloquence. Hood Eloquence. Where the streets meet the literature.